Hi, my name is Mike Keenan. I'm here today from KM Fitness in Manasquan, and I'm going to be giving you your tutorial on cholesterol truths and myths. Okay, it might have been suggested from a friend or your physician that you see this cholesterol truths and myths webinar, and there's going to be a lot of support materials that go along with it. We're going to have other support material like a video and printout of your cholesterol control and nutrition program, your exercise program, including your cardiovascular program, suggested supplements, and stress management tools. So let's get started with the webinar. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the facts about cholesterol. Cholesterol values are just one factor to predict the incidence of cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is still the #1 cause of deaths in the United States, just ahead of cancer. 20% of those with cardiovascular disease have normal to low cholesterol. That's very interesting. We'll talk more about that. And there has been a reduction in total cholesterol with regards to the numbers. However, the death rate remains the same. So let's talk a little bit about that. But let's talk first about what is cholesterol anyway. Well, cholesterol is an organic lipid compound in the family of alcohols, and it has the consistency of earwax. It's obtained through the diet, and it's also manufactured in the liver, and far more is manufactured in the liver than could ever be eaten. Cholesterol is essential to life. It's a hormonal precursor for cortisol, your sex hormones, DHEA, aldosterone, and vitamin D. So let's talk about these in a little more detail. Okay, what is cortisol? Cortisol is secreted from the adrenal glands, and it's also known as your stress hormone. The primary function is to increase blood sugar through a process called gluconeogenesis. It's a process that occurs in the liver, and basically what it is, it's the breakdown of protein to relieve the protein molecule of nitrogen, leaving you with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which is basically reconfigured very easily into glucose to feed the brain and nervous system. It also helps to suppress the immune system, and it aids in fat, protein, and carbohydrate metabolism. Now, the reason it suppresses the immune system is to help to control inflammation in the body. And it's pretty well known at this point that most of our chronic illnesses are due to chronic inflammation. So the ability to suppress the immune system to control inflammation is a very important factor with cortisol. Cortisol is like a lot of other hormones. It all depends on whose company it's in, on how it's going to react. So cortisol with insulin will help to increase fat storage. And that's an important component because there was a time in our genetic past where food wasn't readily available and it needed to be stored, because we weren't able to eat on a day-to-day basis as we were hunting and gathering. So the ability to store fat is important for survival, and our bodies are no different today than they were 10,000 years ago. However, cortisol with human growth hormone helps to increase fat mobilization to be burned for energy, and that's important as we're going through heavy lifting or pushing and pulling. If we caught the meat and we had to carry it back to our campsite, we had to have the energy to do so. So cortisol is a very important component in that process. The next one is sex hormones, and that's for men, it's testosterone, which is created in the testes in the males. Now, women also produce testosterone. They produce it in their adrenal glands. And estrogen. Estrogen is secreted from the ovaries in women. Next one is DHEA. DHEA is produced in the adrenal glands, the gonads, and in the brain. It functions as a metabolic intermediate in the biosynthesis of testosterone and estrogen. So it's kind of a step before you get to estrogen and testosterone. It's part of that chain. And again, it all starts with cholesterol. Next is aldosterone. It's secreted in the adrenal glands, and its primary role is a regulation of blood pressure and the balance of water, especially in the kidneys. And last is vitamin D. Vitamin D's primary responsibility is enhancing intestinal absorption of these key minerals: zinc, calcium, iron, magnesium, and phosphate. It can be absorbed by diets and supplements, But the best source of vitamin D is still sunshine. And it's very important in the prevention of cancer, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, and other autoimmune disorders. Now, cholesterol is also used to make bile, which is a greenish fluid that's produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder. The body needs bile to digest foods that contain fat. So bile acts like an emulsifier. It breaks down large globules of fat into smaller particles so they can easily be digested and mixed with the enzymes that help to digest fat. So the word picture I want to give you here is if you have a pan that you just fried some bacon in, let's say, for example, and you put it in the sink and you put that little drop of dish detergent in, all of a sudden you see the fat start to break up. It emulsifies the fat. So bile basically does the same thing. And what it does in the body is it helps the fat to rise to the top as well, so it can easily be digested. Okay, so here again, once the fat is digested, bile helps the body to absorb it. The presence of bile in the intestines is required before cholesterol can be absorbed from foods. The body also needs bile in order to absorb vitamins A, D, E, and K, called the fat-soluble vitamins, and you get that from food and from supplements. So fat is required for the transporting of vitamin A, D, and E into the body. And your body has the ability to make all the cholesterol it needs for these various functions. So this is an important point. A diet that contains animal products, however, also supplies cholesterol to the body. In an effort to balance these two sources of cholesterol, your body adjusts the amount it produces each day. For example, if you eat many foods from animal sources, your body gets a substantial dose of cholesterol from the diet, called dietary cholesterol. That in turn causes your body to slow down its own production of cholesterol. On the other hand, when most foods you eat come from plant sources, your body manufactures more cholesterol in order to meet its needs. So where is cholesterol utilized? Well, 25% of all cholesterol in the body is in the brain. Why? Well, cholesterol is needed to make myelin. Myelin is the sheath that covers your nerves. And if you have a lack of myelin, you can develop neuromuscular diseases like MS. Cholesterol is also shown to have very strong anti-cancer properties due to its helping the manufacturing of vitamin D. So the question is cholesterol harmful or is it helpful? Well, it all depends. Remember, cholesterol has value and is only one factor in cardiovascular disease, and cardiovascular disease is still the #1 killer. In 2010, there were 600,000 deaths, and those, again, followed very closely by cancer. 20% of all people with cardiovascular disease have low cholesterol. Back in 2010, the average number of total cholesterol was between 210 and 215. Now the average is actually closer to 200, but there's still been no change in mortality. So let's talk about what cholesterol is known to be the bad guy, and we'll kind of delve into this a little deeper. Atherosclerosis is the plaque buildup of cholesterol or plaque buildup in the arteries. Okay, so there's initial injury to the endothelial lining of the vessels. It could be a chemical injury, microbial, hypertension, virus. So LDL is brought down to the site to repair it, kind of like putting new tar in a pothole that we experienced this past winter. Due to the stress of the injury, there's an increase in platelet aggregation, and that happens for a very specific reason. In our genetic past, we might have been involved in a fight or flight situation with a wild animal or someone trying to steal our deer off our shoulder. So as we start to bleed, we have to control the bleeding. So as the artery or the vein is injured, you want to control the bleeding, so you're going to get an increased platelet aggregation. Again, this is another thing that is shown to cause a buildup of plaque in the arteries and also to cause atherosclerosis. You're also going to get an increase in calcium to the site, and that is also known as arteriosclerosis, which basically is a hardening of the arteries. So it's not just cholesterol. there has to be an initial injury. That's why cholesterol is brought there in the first place. So what are some of the other causes? Well, excessive unhealthy fats like vegetable oils and animal fat with something called POPs, which is persistent organic pollutants. And when we think of that, we think of plants that are sprayed with fungicides and herbicides and pesticides, or animals that eat plant material that's loaded with those three. These are also known as persistent organic pollutants. And again, it's the unhealthy fats, the hydrogenated oils and the trans fats, that cause this atherosclerosis buildup in the arteries. Elevated homocysteine level. I'm going to do a little something on homocysteine in a few minutes, so you get to hear a little more about that. Excessive simple carbohydrates. Why would that be? Well, we know that your body wants to have a resting blood sugar no more than 120, and that's in milligrams per deciliter. Once that happens, the body does have the ability to convert excess carbohydrate to triglyceride and store it as fat, and that will again continue to build up our triglyceride levels, which can cause atherosclerosis. Environmental toxins and oxidative stresses, elevated CRP. CRP stands for C-reactive protein. Not only is CRP a marker of inflammation in the body, it's also a cause of inflammation. And it increases something called cytokines and interleukins. Interleukins is an immune response causing inflammation. Now remember earlier we talked about cortisol and how that helps to control inflammation in the body. So it helps to counteract the effects of the interleukins. But elevated CRP is something that causes the arterial walls to swell. When they swell, it decreases the passage space that blood can pass through, and again that can cause increased blood pressure and increased risk of heart attack and stroke. Hemochromatosis is just too much iron in your blood, magnesium deficiencies, lack of excretion via bile. So what we suggest a lot of times is we have people increase the amount of fiber in their diet, which will help to eliminate some of the cholesterol. And the last one is genetic overactivity of HMG-CoA reductase. Okay, and this is the genetic component that started the research and the development of statin drugs. So out of all the things we just talked about, this is the only thing that the statin drugs were developed for. So there's a lot of things we can do with exercise and diet, stress management, that supersedes the need for statin drugs if we do not have a genetic problem with our HMG-CoA reductase. All right, as earlier as I said, we were going to talk about homocysteine. Homocysteine is not obtained through the diet. It is a non-protein amino acid which converts to cysteine by the action of vitamin B. Cysteine is an amino acid which helps protect the liver from alcohol. High homocysteine causes endothelial injury, that's an injury to the inside of your blood vessels, which leads to chronic inflammation, which leads to arthrogenesis, the creation of a blockage in the arteries. And blood clots, of course, leads to blood clots, and then stroke and heart attack. High homocysteine levels are caused by a vitamin B deficiency, specifically B6 and B12. And these are very easily obtained in a supplement form. If you eat animal proteins like red meat and eggs, you're going to get your B vitamins, and also available through some of our plants as well. A large part of our leafy green vegetables are very vitamin B potent. So when you sit down with your physician, he's going to go through some lab studies with you, and I figured let's just go down and break down what LDL, HDL, VLDL, triglyceride. Let's kind of come up with some numbers, and these are the current standards, and your physician will share these with you. Total cholesterol should be at 200 or less, okay, and that's in milligrams per deciliter. LDL should be less than 130, and LDL is, the way we figure out LDL is we take the total cholesterol and we subtract the HDL, and then we subtract the triglycerides divided by 5. So in the example I have below, if your LDL total cholesterol is 180 and your HDL is 60, that equals 120. And if your triglycerides are, let's say they're at 150, which is the top end, we divide that by 5. So we go 120 minus 30 equals 90. So an LDL of 90 would be the result. And that's with going pretty much at all the top levels. So if you're at that level or below, you should consider yourself fairly safe based on the standards, the current standards. So what's the conventional approach to dealing with high cholesterol? Well, we talked a little bit about, and we will talk some more, about dietary modifications, making sure that you're not taking a lot of trans fats, making sure you're staying away from hydrogenated oils, staying away from the POPs, the persistent organic pollutants, having a diet that has more complex carbohydrates as opposed to simple carbohydrates. All agree that the conventional approach is best, but due to poor advice and poor compliance to lifestyle changes, we've had some moderate effects. There are medications that are available. The number one drug that's used is the statins, and of those, Lipitor is probably the top one. So let's talk a little bit more about this. What do statins do? Statins inhibit HMG-CoA reductase, an enzyme used to make cholesterol in the liver. Now remember, your liver can make 1,000,000 times more cholesterol than you could possibly ever eat. So it's what you're eating that can cause the cholesterol to be produced in the liver. If you're eating a lot of very simple carbohydrates, that would be breads, pasta, white rice, muffins, scones, cookies, pies, cakes, okay? Anything that breaks down very, very quickly and releases its sugar very, very quickly is going to cause the body to want to convert that excess sugar to triglyceride and store it as fat. And that's the trigger that causes you to make more cholesterol in your liver. Statins were first approved for those with previous MIs, and that stands for myocardial infarction or heart attack. Important thing to know is statins decrease enzyme CoQ10, which is needed for energy manufacturing in the body. Coenzyme Q10 is like the spark plug that ignites the body's engine by jump-starting energy production within all cells. There is an increased risk of inflammatory disorders with the statin drugs. Now, statistics say that for every 1,000 people taking the drug, 1 will have a positive effect. I've read studies that are more close to 2 to 3 out of 1,000. It's not an awful lot. And keep in mind, a lot of the information that's coming out today talks more about people who've had a previous heart attack having a positive result with not specific advantages for those people who haven't. And that's what the literature is telling us now. Increased cancer risks due to lack of material to make vitamin D. Low testosterone. Some studies have shown significant reductions statistically. Why? Because you need cholesterol to make testosterone. Well, you need cholesterol to make DHEA, which eventually will become testosterone. And there's some information that talks about increased fat storage and increased risk of diabetes. It's possible. More clinical evidence than research evidence. But again, you know, who's funding the research? You have to look at who's doing that. Is there such a thing as being too low? Low cholesterol levels may increase cancer. Cholesterol is a very strong antioxidant. Parkinson's, because again, where is most of the cholesterol in the body used? In the brain to create the myelin. So, you know, it'll affect the fat in the brain, which could cause a decrease in the myelin sheath. There's an increased stroke risk due to failure of the capillary walls not being repaired. You may have heard of people who have been on cholesterol-lowering drugs. They develop a weakening in the aorta. And if the aorta fails, you fail. And a lot of people have had stents put in their aortas to help to stop the weak point from failing. There's mental and mood disorders, depression, violent behavior, and suicide, and poor digestion. Remember, fat digestion due to deficient bile. So what are the predictors of heart disease? Well, the independent lab values that we talked about earlier. Total cholesterol HDL ratio, if it's less than 3.5, that's considered to be good. The lower the better. Having a low HDL. HDL, I teach people, that's kind of like the garbage collector. Cholesterol, it goes around and tries to clean up excess cholesterol to bring it back to the liver to be reprocessed. Triglycerides, increased triglycerides associated with small particle size and is dangerous, as opposed to the larger, which is less dangerous. Now, let me clarify that. The small particle size are usually very dense and very sticky and very much adhere to the arterial walls, kind of like barnacles on the bottom of a boat, where the larger tend to be fluffy and they float and are very easily eliminated by the HDL. So it's important that we make sure that we try to keep our triglycerides low so we don't get this buildup of small particles, kind of like the barnacles, like I said, on the bottom of the boat. Someone who has a higher elevated fasting insulin, again, what's going to happen to the excess carbohydrates that are formed? They eventually become triglyceride and stored as fat. So higher fasting insulin is indicative that you have a high blood sugar. Homocysteine levels are a much higher risk of cardiovascular disease, and it's toxic to the endothelium. Homocysteine is a marker of inflammation in the body, and elevated blood glucose levels, as I spoke about earlier. CRP again is a marker and cause of inflammation in the body, and we also have high sensitivity CRP, which increases your risk of having heart disease. Now, CRP causes an autoimmune response with associated increase of cytokines and interleukins, which are both pro-inflammatory compounds. We talked about that earlier. Platelet aggregation, increased consumption of healthy animal fats, and a decrease in dietary magnesium. So how do we get our magnesium levels up? A lot of leafy green vegetables. And you can supplement with that as well. There's something called Syndrome X. It's another way of predicting cardiovascular disease. And let's go into some specific numbers. And they say if you have 3 or more present, then you indeed have Syndrome X. So if your triglycerides are greater than 150, if your HDL is lower than 40 for men or lower than 50 for women, that's another sign. If your blood pressure is 130 over 85 or higher, or if you're medicated for blood pressure, you have another symptom. If your blood glucose levels are greater than 100, or you're being treated for type 2 diabetes, that's another factor. Central obesity, if your BMI is over 30, or you have a hip-to-waist ratio greater than 0.9 for men or 0.785 for women. So what does that mean? What does hip-to-waist ratio mean? We take the measurement of your waist and compare it to the circumference of your hips. Okay, so for example, we see people come into our studio who have a 50-inch waist and 40-inch hips. Obviously, their waist is bigger than their hips, so their hip-to-waist ratio is greater than 0.9. So it's important that we keep the hip-to-waist ratio in a healthy state. Speaking of waist circumferences, if you're over 40 inches for a man or over 35 inches for a woman, again, that's another factor. Now, there's obviously people like professional athletes, defensive linemen who are in great shape and their waist size may be over 40 inches. So everything has to be taken into consideration. And again, I talked about earlier, other predictors are hemochromatosis, inflammation, high CRP levels, and endothelial injury. The cause of all chronic illness is swelling and inflammation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about stress. How does stress affect cholesterol? Well, it makes a lot of sense. Cholesterol is required for the stress hormone cortisol, so the body will produce more cholesterol in order to produce more cortisol. Stress can be mental, emotional, physical, could be through the diet, or could be spiritual. Now with stress, we have more epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are your excitatory hormones. And this can increase platelet aggregation in a fight or flight response. So what do we mean by that? Well, in a fight or flight response, you may be fighting off a wild animal or someone who's looking to steal your deer that you're carrying back to your camp. And you might get injured, and there could be some bleeding. So in order to stop that bleeding, the platelet aggregation increases. Okay, that's to save your life so you don't bleed to death. But a lot of times our stress has nothing to do with fighting off a wild animal. A lot of our stress has to do, we're sitting in a board meeting, we're getting chewed out by our boss, there's some other stresses in our life that really doesn't put us in a fight or flight response, but we still get that platelet aggregation. And remember, cortisol can increase atherogenesis. So what are some myths about cholesterol? And this is a very famous one here. Eggs are bad for you. Well, that's not necessarily true. Eggs may actually benefit with an increase in phospholipids that help to increase the cell membrane and HDL. So it actually can be very helpful for you. The other myth is high cholesterol is the cause of all heart attacks. Well, that's not true because Eskimos have very high cholesterol and very low cardiovascular disease. Statins work? Well, the statistics say 1 in 1,000. I've read some other studies that talk more like 3 in 1,000. And low is best? Well, we've kind of talked about that. That is not exactly true either. So what are your solutions? Well, here we teach good nutrition, stress management, exercise, sleep, hydration, and when needed, supplementation. So in a cholesterol correction diet, what are we looking to eat? Well, there's going to be a whole nother video just on that, but let me go through this with you real quick. We're looking for a fiber-rich diet, legumes, vegetables, some fruits, but more the low glycemic, like berries, like blueberries, strawberries, blackberries, and so forth. More vegetable-based proteins than dairy. In our correction diet, we don't include any dairy. That's cow, goat, sheep, milk, cheese, yogurt, any of those things, whey protein. The big protein that we use here with our vegetable-based protein are more concentrated brown rice and pea proteins. Then I talk about the big three, grass-fed beef, coconut oil, and avocados. 3 very healthy sources of fats, and they're all saturated fats, which are good for us. Because again, we talked about the need for fat for myelin sheath and the exterior surface of every cell, your cell membranes, they're made from fat. Organic and fermented soy, such as natto or tempeh. Okay, there's a lot of organic tofu out there. We do not recommend that. We only recommend soy the way it's consumed in Japan, and that's a fermented soy. Cold water fish, like krill oil. We use a lot of krill oil. Salmon, cod, tuna. Complex carbohydrates, that could be all your fibrous vegetables, sweet potatoes, brown rice, oatmeal, and fresh garlic and onions. Green tea is another great source. Olive oil, we use olive oil not so much for cooking, but more for salad dressings. Fermented foods such as sauerkraut, alfalfa, and ginger. Spinach, beets, and other greens, especially helpful with homocysteine conversion. Oat bran helps to eliminate bile salts carrying excess cholesterol. What not to eat? Well, we don't believe in eating anything that came out of a feedlot or caged animals because they're loaded with hormones, antibiotics. They're very high in omega-6 and very low in omega-3s. Any hydrogenated oils and trans fats. Polyunsaturated oils like corn oil, canola oil, because they also too are very high in omega-6. Simple sugars, deep fried foods, dairy, excessive zinc and calcium, and wheat and gluten because they're both pro-inflammatory compounds. Some additional interventions could be vitamin B, you could take a supplement, vitamin C, vitamin E, magnesium, chromium, and selenium, copper, and vanadium. Now, most of these are available in a good quality multivitamin, multimineral. L-carnitine is a amino acid which can be used as well. And we'll also talk in our dietary correction, we'll talk about things like branched chain amino acids and cacao. Precautions and concerns. Well, something that's very, very important is to correct thyroid function. Even a slight depression in thyroid activity produces significant shift in healthy cholesterol levels. So if your thyroid is dysfunctional, that's a whole nother seminar, but we should work on correcting that. Correct any hormonal imbalance. Try to filter the chlorine from your drinking water. Use a good filtration system. DHEA may help the elderly. And if you're on statins, you must take coenzyme Q10 supplements. Exercise. Wow. Finally, a fitness studio talking about exercise. Well, what are some of the benefits of exercise? Well, lowers triglyceride and LDL levels while increasing your HDL level. It enhances your mood, helps to improve blood pressure, helps you to regulate your blood sugar, improves your cardiovascular function, promotes weight loss, and, depending on the intensity, significantly helps decrease CRP levels. When we start talking about burst training in our video section on exercise, we'll talk about how to lower CRP by doing specific training. So what's your game plan? Well, the first thing we want to do is improve your diet. We want to help to decrease stress. We want to increase exercise, then and only then, if it's needed, supplementation. I want to thank you for participating in this webinar. Susan has a webinar coming up. Well, actually, she's already done it. So if you go to our KeenanMedicalFitness.com, you'll see the link for that as well. I want to thank everybody for coming out today and allowing me to work with you. And I'll be talking to you shortly.